Good day, welcome to today's class. If this is your first time on this channel, please click on the red subscription button to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that when we drop more videos, you'll be able to get notified. For the sake of this class, we'll be treating a very interesting topic, which is limiting factor. Fine, let me explain what limiting factor is all about. Let's say, for example, we want to produce 10,000 units of goods. So the 10,000, for us to be able to produce 10,000 units of goods, we are going to need 500 laborers, but we did not have up to that 500 laborers. We only have 200 laborers. So in that situation, that 200 laborer that is making us, or that's going to make us not to achieve 10,000 output, is a limiting factor. So what is a limiting factor then? A limiting factor is anything, it can be anything that is hindering a company, a firm, a business from achieving their budgeted sales or their intended sales or their intended output. That's what we call a limiting factor. Limiting factor can be anything, as I said. It can be the raw materials, it can be the labor hours, it can be the available hours, it can be anything. So far as hindering the company, the firm, from meeting their budgeted sales or their desired sales or their desired output, anyhow you want to put it. Now, questions on limiting factors in exams most times comes or deals with at least two products. And why is it two products? Because if I'm producing only one product and there's a limiting factor, I will just use the limiting factor or the available limiting factor to produce the only one product. But questions, like I said earlier, are on two products. And why? Because if I have two products, I have product A and I have product B. So I want to know, and I have a limiting factor. I want to know that if I use my limiting factor to produce A, will A give me more contribution or more profit than using it to produce B? That means that if I have, let's say, I want to produce 1,000 quantity for A and 1,000 quantity for B. But if I spend my resources, that limiting factor to produce, it cannot produce 1,000 for each. It can only produce 1,000 for one and 500 for the others. So I want to know that if I spend my resources, my limited resources, producing 1,000 of A and producing 500 of B, will it give me higher revenue than producing 1,000 of B and producing 500 of A? This is what I mean. That means that if I produce 1,000 of A plus 500 of B, let's say it's going to give me 7,000 naira revenue. Or if I produce 1,000 of B plus 500 of A, is going to give me, let's say, 8,500 revenue. So that is why I said most questions on limiting factors always deals with at least two products. So we want to know, since we have a limiting factor, we want to know that how can I mix my production? How can I prorate my production that it is going to give me the highest possible revenue so far, or the highest possible contribution, whatever you want to call it. But let me just explain how we go about preparing or dealing with limiting factor. Now consider we have two products. We have product A and product B, and we have a limiting factor. If you have a limiting factor and you are meant to produce two products or three products or four, sorry, whatever the case might be, the thing you need to do is to calculate the contribution per unit for each goods you are producing. I'm producing goods A, I'm producing goods B. So what you need to do first, calculate the contribution per unit. And I've explained it in my CVP analysis video. If you have not watched it, I'm going to drop it under this video. That contribution is equals to sales minus variable costs per unit. So the contribution is equals to sales minus the variable cost per unit. So what is required of me if I want to solve questions on limiting factor? The first thing that's required of me is to calculate the contribution that I'm getting from each product. Contribution that I'm getting from each product. So how am I going to do that? Let's say, for example, this is how the format looks like. You have your sales, selling price per unit for A. Let's say it is this. Selling price for B, it is this. So we have sorry, we will now subtract, we will less our variable costs of production. variable cost of production. So that's the first thing. You get your sales selling price for each. So let's your variable cost of production. Variable cost of production. Let's say we have direct materials. Direct materials. We have our direct expenses. Direct expenses. Let's leave it there like that. So you will subtract your variable cost of production from your selling price of each, and that will give you your contribution. So let's say this is our contribution per unit. Contribution per unit. Now, I want you guys to listen and follow attentively. When you get to this point now, you've already calculated the sales or the selling price for A and the variable cost, you've gotten the contribution. The next thing you need to do is you want to get the contribution per limiting factor. What does that mean by contribution per limiting factors? Let me play an illustration for you guys so that you get it better. Now look at this. Let's say the next thing you are going to do, let me put it this way. The next thing you are going to do is the limiting factor that is placing, that will not allow us to meet our sales. You ask yourself, how many of that limiting factors is necessary or must be necessary for me to produce A? Let's say for that limiting factor, for me to produce A, I'm going to need one materials or one raw materials. The raw materials I'm buying is the limiting factor, and for me to produce A, I need one raw materials. For me to produce B, I also need one raw materials. So I'm going to say, let me assume a price for our contribution per unit. Let's say contribution per unit for A is 56 and contribution per unit for B is 40, and the limiting factor that is used for producing these materials is 1 each. That means that for me to produce one quantity of A, I need one materials, and that materials is the limiting factor. For me to produce one unit of B, I need one materials, and that materials is the limiting factor. The next thing you are going to see is from this is your limiting factor. So you are now going to divide your contribution per unit divided by your limiting factor. Why are we dividing our contribution per unit divided by our limiting factor? Because we want to get the contribution we get, or the contribution we will realize if we spend 1 unit, or so 1 unit of our limiting factor, if we spend it on producing A, how much contribution am I going to realize? So 56 divided by 1, I have 56. 40 divided by 1, I have 40. So what does this mean? It means that if I produce A with one materials or with one raw materials, which is the limiting factor, I'm going to get 56 contribution, or 56 naira as my contribution. And if I produce B with my limiting factor, which is also 1, I'm going to get 40 naira as my limiting factor. So this, what you get here, is called contribution per limiting factor. So as simple as that, you get your contribution per limiting factor. That means that your limiting factor, the amount required to produce A is 1, the amount required to produce B is 1. So 56 divided by 1 will give me 56, 40 divided by 1 will give me 40. That means that on one raw materials I spent on producing A, I'm making 56 contribution. On one materials I spent producing B, I'm making 40 contribution. So which one will you advise me, or which one will I advise the company to produce? Of course it is A, because from there I make more contribution. So this is how to tackle questions on limiting factor. Let's take an illustration and let's see how we are going to solve a real life practical question. So the question goes thus: Chiboy Incorporated produces 3 products, namely pucks, quarks, and rocks, from the same raw materials using the same production facilities. The requisite labor is available at 56 naira per hour for all products. The raw materials is imported from a neighboring West African country at 56 naira per kg and is limited to 72,800 kg for the month of June 2017. The variable overheads are 36.20 naira per direct hour. The fixed overheads are 350,000 naira for the month. The selling commission is 10% on sales. The following information were provided. the product, the market demand, selling price per unit, labor hour required per hour, raw materials required per unit. So POX 56,000 market demand and the selling price is 210 naira. Labor required to produce 1 unit is 1 hour and raw materials required is 0.7. Works 42,000 market demand, 280 is the selling price, 2 hours is the required time to produce it, and 0.4 is the raw materials required to produce. Rocks at 5,000 market demand, 350 naira is the selling price, 1.5 hour is the hour required to produce, and 1.5 raw materials is the raw materials required to produce. So you are required to suggest the most suitable sales mix which will maximize the firm's profit and also determine the profit that will be earned at that level. Now, good. If you look at this question very well, you see that it's a question on limiting factor. And from the question, we were told that the limiting factor is raw materials and 72,800 per kg is what we have available for the month of June. 72,800. So that's the limiting factor. So we follow the normal process, we get our contribution per unit, which is very simple. So Chiboy Incorporated, Chiboy Incorporated, Chiboy Incorporated, we are going to be having the three products we are producing, which is POX, Quarks, and Rocks. POX, sorry, POX, Quarks, and Rocks. So let's go. We are going to be having our selling price or sales. So from the question, we're told our selling price for POX is 210 naira. Selling price for POX is 210 naira. Selling price for Quarks is 280 naira. And selling price for Rocks is 350 naira. So what are we going to do next? We are going to subtract our variable cost per unit. So going by that, what are our variable costs per unit? So variable cost of production less variable costs, so that we can get our contribution. So from our variable costs, we are told that, reading from the question, the requisite labor is available at 56 naira per hour. That means that labor that are going to engage in production is, we are paying them 56 naira per 1 hour. So how many hours is required to produce POX? How many hours is required to produce Quarks and Rocks is what we are going to use to multiply the labor, the amount they are paying labor per hour. Cost of labor or labor cost, yes. The requisite labor is available at 50. Yes, so labor. So we have labor. Our labor is available at 56 naira per hour. And if you go back to the question, if you look at it under the hours required to produce each goods, they said 1 hour is for POX. So if they are paying laborers 1 hour for 1 hour 56 naira, and for producing 1 hour for producing POX is 1 hour, so they are going to be paying the laborer 56 naira for producing one POX, because that is it only takes 1 hour to produce POX. So labor, we have 56 naira for POX. How many hours does it take to produce POX? 2 hours. So 2 hours, that will be 56 times 2 to produce one. 56 times 2, that will be 112 hours to produce POX. 112 hours. And for Rocks, how many hours does it take? It takes 1.5 hours. So 1.5 hours times 56, that will give us 84 labor cost per unit of POX, 56, this and this. So if you continue, that the raw materials is imported from a neighboring West African country at 56 naira per kg. So raw materials that we use in producing all these three goods is 56 naira per 1 kg. 56 naira per 1 kg. So raw materials. So the question is, how many raw materials does it take to produce one of this? How many raw materials does it take to produce this and this? Because if it is 56 naira per 1 kg, so how many kg does it take? How many kg does it take? Whatever kg it takes, we multiply it by 56 naira. So we have 56 naira per kg. So materials now, raw materials, it said 56 naira per kg. So it takes 0.7 raw materials to produce POX. 0.7 raw materials to produce POX. So 0.7 times 56, that gives us 39.2. That's the cost of raw materials for producing quarks, 39.2. So it takes 0.4 raw materials to produce quarks. So 0.4 times 56, that gives us 22.4. Yes, with 22.4. 22.4. And for the last one, it takes 1.5 raw materials to produce 1.5 times 56, that's 84. That gives us 84. So is there any other variable cost that we have not picked from the question? So the variable overhead, yes, variable overhead. So we come again, variable overhead. So you say the variable overhead are 39.20 per direct hour. 39.20 per direct hour. So that means that for 1 hour of production, variable overhead is 39.20. So for 1 hour of production is 39.20. So for 2 hours will be 39.20 times whatever we have there. So from the question, how many labor hours does it take to produce box? It takes 1 hour, right? So variable overhead is 39.20. How many hours does it take to produce quarks? It takes 2 hours. So 2 hours, that will be 39.2 times 2. So 78.4. 78.4. And how many hours does it take to produce rocks? 1.5 hours. So 1.5 hours times 39.2, which is 58.8. 58.8. So is there any other variable cost that we have in the question that we have not cited here? Yes, there's another one, and which is the selling commission. You guys should know that selling commission or commission for agents is also a variable cost. Why? Because variable costs are costs that changes with the level of output. If the agent sells more, there will be higher commission for him. If he sells less, there will be lesser commission for him. That's what mean by variable costs. Variable costs are costs that changes when the quantity produced changes or when the output changes. So, and if you produce more, if he sells more, the agent is going to collect more commission. And if you sell less, so that's a variable cost. It changes with it. So selling commission also, I think that's the last. Selling commission, which is how much? Selling commission is 10% on sales. So that's 10% on the selling price. So if you go by our calculator, 10% on sales, which is 10% on the selling price, for box is 10% of 210, that's 21. For quarks, 10% of 280, that's 28. And for rocks, that's 35. So I think that is all of our variable costs of producing 1 unit. So now, the next thing we need to do here now is to calculate our contribution per unit. So before we can calculate our contribution per unit, let's first sum all our variable cost of production. So if we add all our variable cost of production, that will be 56 plus 39.2 plus 39.2 plus 21, that gives us 155.4. 155.4. So same thing, 112 plus 22.4 plus 78.4 plus 28, that'll be 240.8. And for the last one, we have 84 plus 84 plus 58.8 plus 35, that'll be 261.8. So this is the variable cost of producing the 3 units. So now, if I've gotten the variable cost of producing the 3 units, now the next thing I need to get is my contribution per unit. So contribution per unit will be 210 minus my total variable cost of production. So 210 minus 155.4, that'll give me 54.6. 54.6. So now guys, so if you subtract the selling price minus variable cost of production, you will get 39.2, and for this you get 88.2. So now the question is, the next thing we need to do is that how many of the limiting factor, what's the limiting factor? From the question we're told that the limiting factor is raw materials, but so we now pick how many raw materials is required to produce this, how many raw materials is required to produce this, how many raw materials is required to produce this. So from our question we told that, so we go now limiting factor. limiting factor. So our limiting factor from our question is raw material. So how many raw materials is required to produce quarks? From our question, 0.7 raw materials is required to produce quark. For quarks, 0.4, and for rocks, 1.5. So if this is our contribution per unit, let me read this way. Contribution per unit divided by limiting factor is what we are going to use to rate which one will produce more and which one will produce less. So if you go by my calculator here, if I say I'm coming, so we will rank them now. 54.6 divided by 0.7. 54.6 divided by 0.7, that gives us 78. So 78. And 39.2 divided by 0.4. 39.2 divided by 0.4, that gives us 98. 98. And lastly, 88.2 divided by 1.5. 88.2 divided by 1.5, that gives us 58.8. 58.8. So now, which one should be produced more? Which one should be produced less? Which one should be, So definitely, according to what we have here now, quarks should be ranked first. All of quarks should be produced, followed by all of quarks, and lastly, all of rocks. So this is the order in which we should produce quarks, and rocks. Now, because that's not all the questions we were asked. They also asked us that they said suggest the most suitable sales mix. So this is the most suitable sales mix: first, second, and third, which will maximize the firm profit and also determine the profit that will be earned at that level. So we need to determine the profit that will be earned at if they are producing all of quarks, and the remaining raw materials to produce rocks. So we need to determine how many or what's the profit that will be earned at that level. So let's go. So guys, now as you can see, from what we've calculated earlier, I've bring out the most important point which we need to solve the next stage. So we already know that quarks is the first one that should be produced and it's already the first, followed by the second, which is quarks, and the third, which is what? Rocks. And their contribution per unit is 54.6, 39.2, and 88.2. That means that for 1 unit of production, they'll be earning 54.6 as contribution on this, and on that. So now the question says we should calculate which sales mix will maximize this production. Don't forget, now, if you look at the question already, they said the market demand is for quarks. Market demand, let's go. Market demand for quarks. Market demand for quarks is 56,000. From the question, market demand for quarks is 42,000, and market demand for rocks is 35,000. So since they should first produce all of quarks, right? So now if they are producing all of quarks, it will be the order at which they will produce is quarks first. Quarks, the market demand is 42,000. 42,000 is what the market is demanding, multiplied by how many raw materials is required to produce one. If they are demanding 42,000 and the materials required, the limiting factor that is required to produce one, which is the raw materials for quarks, right? For quarks, yes, is 0.4. 0.4. So we should first produce quarks, then we now produce quarks. For quarks, the market demand is 56,000 times what is the raw materials required, limiting factor of the raw materials required 0.7. Then we come back to rocks. Let's leave rocks first because the raw materials is not enough, So now 42,000 multiplied by 0.4, that gives us 16,800. So the raw materials that we needed to be able to produce quarks is 16,800 kg. 16,800 kg of raw materials. So the raw materials that we needed to produce rocks is 56,000 multiplied by 0.7, and that's 39,200 kg. So now, and from the question, they already said that it has been said in the question that the raw materials available is 72,800. Of course, if you had 39,200 plus 16,800 is 56,000. So 72,800, the available materials minus 56,000, we are left with 16,800 raw materials. So the 16.8, the total raw materials available is 72,800. It is not enough to produce this 3. So we have spent, out of this 7,200 kg, we spent 16,800 to produce quarks. We spent 39,200 to produce quarks. So the rest is what we are going to be using to produce rocks. And the remaining, or the rest, is 16,800 kg. So how are you going to get that? 17,800 minus this and this will give you 16,800 to produce rocks. So now, with 16,800 kg, how many quantity of rocks will we be able to produce? So with 16,800 kg, how many quantity of rocks will we be able to produce? We already told in the question that the raw materials necessary for producing one rocks is 1.5, is in the question. So 16,800 divided by 1.5 will give me the amount of quantity I'm going to produce for quarks. Because if it takes 1.5 to produce one, and I have 16,000 raw materials, so 16,000 divided by 1.5 will give you the amount you can produce, and the amount I can produce for quarks, for rocks, is 11,200. 11,200. So now, since I've gotten the amount I can produce for each of my 3 products, for quarks I can produce 42,000, for rocks I can produce 56,000, for rocks I can produce 11,200. How am I going to get my profits? Now, for us to get the profits, because that's what we are told to calculate. Now, what are we going to do? For quarks, contribution per unit I'm getting for quarks is 39.2. So if I'm getting on 1 unit of production, I'm getting 39.2 contribution, then how much am I going to be getting on 42,000 units? So 42,000 times 39.2, that's 1,646,400 for quarks, 1,646,200. So you do the same thing for quarks, you do the same thing for quarks. 56,000 times contribution per unit for quarks. So 56,000 times contribution per unit for quarks, which is 54.6, and that will be plus 3,057,600. So plus for rocks, 11,200 is what I will be producing, and there is a contribution per unit of 88.2. So 11,200 times 88.2. So this is my total contribution. If I add everything together, 97,840 plus 3,057,600 plus 1,646,200, I'll be getting total contribution will be 5,691,640. So this will be the total contribution that I get from all the products, 5,691,640. And you know that for you to get your profit after getting your contribution, you just subtract your fixed cost of production. So from our question, our fixed overhead is 350,000. So less fixed costs or fixed overhead, which is 350,000. So if you take out 350,000, I will have 5,341,640 naira as my net profit. So this will be my net profit. So we've come to the end of today's class. Please, if you have any points at any point where you don't understand, pause the video, go back so that you get it a better, clear understanding. So in our next class we are going to meet. It's a goodbye for now. Thank you. See you in our next video lecture.